Chapter 78 of Can You Forgive Her? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Can You Forgive Her? By Anthony Trollope. Chapter 78, Mr. Cheesacre's Fate. It must be acknowledged that Mrs. Greenow was a woman of great resources, and that she would be very prudent for others, though I fear the verdict of those who know her must go against her in regard to prudence in herself. Her marriage with Captain Bellfield was a rash act, certainly a rash act, although she did take so much care in securing the payment of her own income into her own hands. But the manner in which she made him live discreetly for some months previous to his marriage, the tact with which she renewed the friendship which had existed between him and Mr. Cheesacre, and the skill she used in at last providing Mr. Cheesacre with a wife, oblige us all to admit that, as a general, she had great powers. When Alice reached Vavasor Hall, she found Charlie Fairstairs established there on a long visit. Charlie and Kate were to be the two bridesmaids, and as Kate told her cousin in their first confidential intercourse on the evening of Alice's arrival, there were already great hopes in the household that the master of Oileymead might be brought to surrender. It was true that Charlie had not a shilling, and that Mr. Cheesacre had set his heart on marrying an heiress. It was true that Miss Fairstairs had always stood low in the gentleman's estimation, as being connected with people who were as much without rank and fashion as they were without money, and that the gentleman loved rank and fashion dearly. It was true that Charlie was no beauty, and that Cheesacre had an eye for feminine charms. It was true that he had despised Charlie, and had spoken his contempt openly, that he had seen the girl on the sands at Yarmouth every summer for the last 10 years, and about the streets of Norwich every winter, and had learnt to regard her as a thing poor and despicable, because she was common in his eyes. It is thus that the Cheesacres judge of people. But in spite of all these difficulties, Mrs. Greenow had taken up poor Charlie's case, and Kate Vavasor expressed a strong opinion that her aunt would win. "What has she done to the man?" Alice asked. "Coaxed him. Simply that. She has made herself so much his master that he doesn't know how to say no to her. Sometimes I have thought that he might possibly run away, but I have abandoned that fear now. She has little confidences with him from day to day, which are so alluring to him that he cannot tear himself off. In the middle of one of them he will find himself engaged." "But the unfortunate girl! Won't it be a wretched marriage for her?" "Not at all. She'll make him a very good wife. He's one of those men to whom any woman, after a little time, will come to be the same. He'll be rough with her once a month or so, and perhaps tell her that she brought no money with her, but that won't break any bones, and Charlie will know how to fight her own battles. She'll save his money if she brings none, and in a few years' time they will quite understand each other." Mr. Cheesacre and Captain Bellfield were at this time living in lodgings together at Penrith, but came over and spent every other day at Vavasor, returning always to their lodgings in the evening. It wanted but 8 days to the marriage when Alice arrived, and preparations for that event were in progress. "It's to be very quiet, Alice," said her aunt, "as quiet as such a thing can be made. I owe that to the memory of the departed one. I know that he is looking down upon me, and that he approves all that I do. Indeed, he told me once that he did not want me to live desolate for his sake. If I didn't feel that he was looking down and approving it, I should be wretched indeed." She took Alice up to see her trousseau, and gave the other expectant bride some little hints, which, under present circumstances, might be useful. Yes, indeed. Only 3 and 6pence apiece, and they're quite real. Feel them. You wouldn't get them in the shops under 6. Alice did feel them, and wondered whether her aunt could have saved the half-crown honestly. I had my eyes about me when I was up in town, my dear. And look here, these are quite new, have never been on yet, and I had them when I was married before. There is nothing like being careful, my dear. I hate meanness, as everybody knows who knows me, but there is nothing like being careful. You have a lot of rich people about you just now, and will have ever so many things given you, which you won't want. Do you put them all by, and be careful. They may turn out useful, you know. Saying this, Mrs. Greenow folded up, among her present bridal belongings, sundries of the wealth which had accrued to her in an earlier stage of her career. And then Mrs. Greenow opened her mind to Alice about the captain. He's as good as gold, my dear. He is indeed, in his own way. Of course I know he has faults, and I should like to know who hasn't, although poor dear Greenow certainly was more without them than anybody else I ever knew. As this remembrance came upon Mrs. Greenow, she put her handkerchief to her eyes, and Alice observed that that which she held still bore the deepest hem of widowhood. They would be used, no doubt, till the last day, and then put by in lavender for future possible occasions. Belfield may have been a little extravagant. I dare say he has. But how can a man help being extravagant when he hasn't got any regular income? He has been ill-treated in his profession, very. It makes my blood curdle when I think of it. After fighting his country's battles through blood and dust and wounds. But I'll tell you about that another time. I suppose a man seldom does make a fortune, aunt, by being a soldier. Never, my dear. Much better to be a tailor. Don't you ever marry a soldier. But as I was saying, he is the best-tempered creature alive, and the staunchest friend I ever met. You should hear what Mr. Cheesacre says of him. But you don't know Mr. Cheesacre? No, aunt, not yet. If you remember, he went away before I saw him when he came here before. Yes, I know. Poor fellow. Between you and me, Kate might have had him if she liked. But perhaps Kate was right. I don't think he would have suited Kate at all. Because of the farmyard, you mean? Kate shouldn't give herself airs. Money's never dirty, you know. But perhaps it's all for the best. There's a sweet girl here to whom he is violently attached, and who I hope will become Mrs. Cheesacre. But as I was saying, the friendship between these two men is quite wonderful, and I have always observed that when a man can create that kind of affection in the bosom of another man, he invariably is the sort of man, the man, in fact, who makes a good husband. Alice knew the story of Charlie Fairstairs and her hopes, knew of the quarrels between Belfield and Cheesacre, knew almost as much of Belfield's past life as Mrs. Greenow did herself, and Mrs. Greenow was no doubt aware that such was the case. Nevertheless, she had a pleasure in telling her own story, and told it as though she believed every word that she spoke. On the following day the two gentlemen came over, according to custom, and Alice observed that Miss Fairstairs hardly spoke to Mr. Cheesacre. Indeed, her manner of avoiding that gentleman was so very marked that it was impossible not to observe it. They drank tea out of doors, and when Mr. Cheesacre on one occasion sauntered over towards the end of the bench on which Charlie was sitting, Charlie got up and walked away. And in strolling about the place afterwards, and in going up through the wood, she was at great pains to attach herself to some other person, so that there should be no such attaching between her and the owner of Oileymead. At one time Mr. Cheesacre did get close up to her, and spoke some word, some very indifferent word. He knew that he was being cut, and he wanted to avoid the appearance of a scene.
"I don't know, sir,"
said Charlie, again moving away with excellent dignity, and she at once attached herself to Alice, who was close by.
"I know you have just come home from Switzerland," said Charlie. "Beautiful Switzerland. My heart pants for Switzerland. Do tell me something about Switzerland."
Mr. Cheesacre had heard that Alice was the dear friend of a lady who would probably some day become a duchess. He therefore naturally held her in awe, and slunk away. On this occasion Mrs. Greenow clung lovingly to her future husband, and the effect was that Mr. Cheesacre found himself to be very much alone and unhappy. He had generally enjoyed these days at Vavasor Hall, having found himself, or fancied himself, to be the dominant spirit there. That Mrs. Greenow was always in truth the dominant spirit, I need hardly say. But she knew how to make a companion happy, and well also how to make him wretched. On the whole of this day, poor Cheesacre was very wretched. "I don't think I shall go there any more," he said to Belfield, as he drove the gig back to Penrith that evening. "Not go there any more, Cheesy?" said Belfield. "Why, we are to have the dinner out in the field on Friday. It's your bespeak." "Well, yes, I'll go on Friday, but not after that." "You'll stop and see me turned off, old fellow." "What's the use? You'll get your wife, and that's enough for you. The truth is that since that girl came down from London with her damned airs," the girl from London with the airs was poor Alice, "the place is quite changed. I'm blessed if the whole thing isn't as dark as ditch water. I'm a plain man, I am, and I do hate your swells." Against this view of the case Captain Belfield argued stoutly, but Cheesacre had been offended, and throughout the next day he was cross and touchy. He wouldn't play billiards, and on one occasion hinted that he hoped he should get that money soon. "You did admirably, my dear," said Mrs. Greenow that night to Charlie Fairstairs. The widow was now on terms almost more confidential with Miss Fairstairs than with her own niece, Kate Vavasor. She loved a little bit of intrigue, and though Kate could intrigue, as we have seen in this story, Kate would not join her aunt's intrigues. "You did it admirably. I really did not think you had so much in you."
"Oh, I don't know,"
said Charlie, blushing at the praise. "And it's the only way, my dear, the only way. I mean, for you with such a one as him. And if he does come round, you'll find him an excellent husband."
"I don't think he cares for me a bit,"
said Charlie, whimpering. "Pooh! Nonsense! Girls never know whether men care for them or not. If he asks you to marry him, won't that be a sign that he cares for you? And if he don't, why, there'll be no harm done."
"If he thinks it's his money,"
began Charlie. "Now, don't talk nonsense, Charlie," said Mrs. Greenow, "or you'll make me sick. Of course it's his money, more or less. You don't mean to tell me you'd go and fall in love with him if he was like Belfield and hadn't got a rap? I can afford that sort of thing. You can't. I don't mean to say you ain't to love him. Of course you're to love him. And I've no doubt you will, and make him a very good wife. I always think that worldliness and sentimentality are like brandy and water. I don't like either of them separately, but taken together they make a very nice drink. I like them warm, with, as the gentlemen say." To this little lecture Miss Fairstairs listened with dutiful patience, and when it was over she said nothing more of her outraged affections or of her disregard for money.
"And now, my dear, mind you look your best on Friday. I'll get him away immediately after dinner, and when he's done with me, you can contrive to be in his way, you know."
The next day was what Kate called the blank day at the Hall. The ladies were all alone, and devoted themselves, as was always the case on the blank days, to millinery and household cares. Mrs. Greenow, as has before been stated, had taken a lease of the place, and her troubles extended beyond her mere bridal wardrobe. Large trunks of household linen had arrived, and all this linen was marked with the name of Greenow. Greenow 5.58, Greenow 7.52, and a good deal had to be done before this ancient wealth of housewifery could probably be converted to Belfield purposes.
"We must cut out the pieces, Jeanette, and work them in again ever so carefully," said the widow, after some painful consideration. "It will always show," said Jeanette, shaking her head. "But the other would show worse," said the widow, "and if you fine draw it, not one person in 10 will notice it. We'd always put them on with the name to the feet, you know." It was not quite true that Cheesacre had bespoke the dinner out in the field, although, no doubt, he thought he had done so. The little treat, if treat it was, had all been arranged by Mrs. Greenow, who was ever ready to create festivities. There was not much scope for a picnic here. Besides their own party, which of course included the captain and Mr. Cheesacre, no guest could be caught except the clergyman. That low church clergyman who was so anxious about his income, and with whom the old squire had quarrelled. Mrs. Greenow had quickly obtained the advantage of his alliance, and he, who was soon to perform on her behalf the marriage ceremony, had promised to grace this little festival. The affair simply amounted to this, that they were to eat their dinner uncomfortably in the field instead of comfortably in the dining room. But Mrs. Greenow knew that Charlie's charms would be much strengthened by a dinner out of doors. "Nothing," she said to Kate, "nothing makes a man come forward so well as putting him altogether out of his usual tack. A man who wouldn't think of such a thing in the drawing-room would be sure to make an offer if he spent an evening with a young lady downstairs in the kitchen." At 2 o'clock the gig from Penrith arrived at the Hall, and for the next hour both Cheesacre and the captain were engaged in preparing the tables and carrying out the viands. The captain and Charlie Fairstairs were going to lay the cloth. "Let me do it," said Cheesacre, taking it out of the captain's hands. "Oh, certainly," said the captain, giving up his prize. "Captain Belfield would do it much better," said Charlie, with a little toss of her head. "He's as good as a married man, and they always do these things best." The day was fine, and although the shade was not perfect, and the midges were troublesome, the dinner went off very nicely. It was beautiful to see how well Mrs. Greenow remembered herself about the grace, seeing that the clergyman was there. She was just in time, and would have been very angry with herself and have thought herself awkward had she forgotten it. Mr. Cheesacre sat on her right hand, and the clergyman on her left, and she hardly spoke a word to Belfield. Her sweetest smiles were all given to Cheesacre. She was specially anxious to keep her neighbour, the parson, in good humour, and therefore illuminated him once in every 5 minutes with a passing ray. But the full splendour of her light was poured out upon Cheesacre as it never had before been poured. How she did flatter him, and with what a capacious gullet did he swallow her flatteries! Oileymead was the only paradise she had ever seen. Ah me, when I think of it sometimes! But never mind. A moment came to him when he thought that even yet he might win the race,
and send Belfield away howling into outer darkness. A moment came to him, and the widow saw the moment well.
"I know I have done for the best," said she, "and therefore I shall never regret it. At any rate, it's done now."
"Not done yet," said he plaintively.
"Yes, done, and done, and done. Besides, a man in your position in the county should always marry a wife younger than yourself, a good deal younger."
Cheesacre did not understand the argument, but he liked the allusion to his position in the county, and he perceived that it was too late for any changes in the present arrangements. But he was happy, and all that feeling of animosity to Alice had vanished from his breast. Poor Alice! She at any rate was innocent. With so much of her own to fill her mind, she had been but little able to take her share in the Greenow festivities, and we may safely say that if Mr. Cheesacre's supremacy was on any occasion attacked, it was not attacked by her. His supremacy on this occasion was paramount, and during the dinner and after the dinner he was allowed to give his orders to Belfield in a manner that must have gratified him much.
"You must have another glass of champagne with me, my friend," said Mrs. Greenow,
and Mr. Cheesacre drank the other glass of champagne. It was not the second nor the third that he had taken. After dinner they started off for a ramble through the fields, and Mrs. Greenow and Mr. Cheesacre were together. I think that Charlie Fairstairs did not go with them at all. I think she went into the house and washed her face and brushed her hair and settled her muslin. I should not wonder if she took off her frock and ironed it again. Captain Belfield, I know, went with Alice, and created some astonishment by assuring her that he fully meant to correct the error of his ways. "I know what it is," he said, "to be connected with such a family as yours, Miss Vavasor." He too had heard about the future Duchess, and wished to be on his best behaviour. Kate fell to the lot of the parson.
"This is the last time we shall ever be together in this way," said the widow to her friend.
"Oh no," said Cheesacre, "I hope not."
"The last time. On Wednesday I become Mrs. Belfield, and I need hardly say that I have many things to think of before that. Mr. Cheesacre, I hope we are not to be strangers hereafter."
Mr. Cheesacre said that he hoped not. Oileymead would always be open to Captain and Mrs. Belfield.
"We all know your hospitality," said she. "It is not to-day nor to-morrow that I or my husband, that is to be, will have to learn that. He always declares that you are the very beau ideal of an English country gentleman."
"Merely a poor Norfolk farmer," said Cheesacre. "I never want to put myself beyond my own place. There has been some talk about the commission of the peace, but I don't think anything of it."
"It has been the greatest blessing in the world for him that he has ever known you," said Mrs. Greenow, still talking about her future husband.
"I've tried to be good-natured, that's all. Damn me, Mrs. Greenow, what's the use of living if one doesn't try to be good-natured? There isn't a better fellow than Belfield living. He and I ran for the same plate, and he has won it. He's a lucky fellow, and I don't begrudge him his luck."
"That's so manly of you, Mr. Cheesacre. But indeed the plate you speak of was not worth your running for."
"I may have my own opinion about that, you know."
"It was not. Nobody knows that as well as I do, or could have thought over the whole matter so often. I know very well what my mission is in life. The mistress of your house, Mr. Cheesacre, should not be any man's widow."
"She wouldn't be a widow then, you know."
"A virgin heart should be yours, and a virgin heart may be yours if you choose to accept it."
"Oh, bother." If you choose to take my solicitude on your behalf in that way, of course I have done. You were good enough to say just now that you wished to see me and my husband in your hospitable halls. After all that has passed, do you think that I could be a visitor at your house unless there is a mistress there?" "Upon my word, I think you might." "No, Mr. Cheesacre, certainly not. For all our sakes I should decline. But if you were married—" "You're always wanting to marry me, Mrs. Greenow."
I do. It is the only way in which there can be any friendship between us, and not for worlds would I lose that advantage for my husband, let alone what I may feel for myself."
"Why didn't you take me yourself, Mrs. Greenow?" "If you can't understand, it is not for me to say anything more, Mr. Cheesacre. If you value the warm affection of a virgin heart—" "Why, Mrs. Greenow, all yesterday she wouldn't say a word to me."
"Not say a word to you? Is that all you know about it? Are you so ignorant that you cannot see when a girl's heart is breaking beneath her stays?"
This almost improper allusion had quite an effect on Mr. Cheesacre's sensitive bosom. "Did you say a word to her yesterday? And if not, why have you said so many words before?"
"Oh, Mrs. Greenow, come."
"It is oh, Mrs. Greenow." But it is time that we should go back to them. They had been sitting all this time on a bank under a hedge. "We will have our tea, and you shall have your pipe and brandy and water, and Charlie shall bring it to you. Shall she, Mr. Cheesacre?" "If she likes, she shall, of course." "Do you ask her, and she'll like it quick enough. But remember, Mr. Cheesacre, I'm quite serious in what I say about your having a mistress for your house. Only think what an age you'll be when your children grow up, if you don't marry soon now." They returned to the field in which they had dined, and found Charlie under the trees, with her muslin looking very fresh. "What, all a mort?" said Mrs. Greenow. Charlie did not quite understand this, but replied that she preferred being alone. "I have told him that you should fill his pipe for him," said Mrs. Greenow.
"He doesn't care for ladies to fill his pipe for him," said Charlie.
"Do you try," said the widow, "while I go indoors and order the tea." It had been necessary to put the bait very close before Cheesacre's eyes, or there would have been no hope that he might take it. The bait had been put so very close that we must feel sure that he saw the hook. But there are fish so silly that they will take the bait although they know the hook is there. Cheesacre understood it all. Many things he could not see, but he could see that Mrs. Greenow was trying to catch him as a husband for Charlie Fairstairs, and he knew also that he had always despised Charlie, and that no worldly advantage whatever would accrue to him by a marriage with such a girl. But there she was, and he didn't quite know how to avoid it. She did look rather nice in her clear starched muslin frock, and he felt that he should like to kiss her. He needn't marry her because he kissed her. The champagne which had created the desire also gave him the audacity. He gave one glance around him to see that he was not observed, and then he did kiss Charlie Fairstairs under the trees.
"Oh, Mr. Cheesacre!"
said Charlie. "Oh, Mr. Cheesacre!" echoed a laughing voice. And poor Cheesacre, looking round, saw that Mrs. Greenow, who ought to have been inside the house looking after the boiling water, was moving about, for some unknown reason, within sight of the spot which he had chosen for his dalliance.
"Mr. Cheesacre,"
said Charlie, sobbing,
"how dare you do that, and where all the world could see you?"
"It was only Mrs. Greenow," said Cheesacre.
"And what will she think of me?"
Lord bless you, she won't think anything about it." "But I do. I think a great deal about it. I don't know what to do. I don't. Whereupon Charlie got up from her seat under the trees and began to move away slowly. Cheesacre thought about it for a moment or two. Should he follow her, or should he not? He knew that he had better not follow her. He knew that she was bait with a very visible hook. He knew that he was a big fish for whom these two women were angling. But after all, perhaps it wouldn't do him much harm to be caught. So he got up and followed her. I don't suppose she meant to take the way towards the woods, towards the little path leading to the old summer-house up in the trees. She was too much beside herself to know where she was going, no doubt. But that was the path she did take, and before long she and Cheesacre were in the summer-house together.
"Don't, Sam, don't. Somebody really will be coming."
"Well, then, there.
Now I won't do it again."
'Twas thus she spoke when the last kiss was given on this occasion, unless there may have been one or two later in the evening, to which it is not necessary more especially to allude here. But on the occasion of that last kiss in the summer-house, Miss Fairstairs was perfectly justified by circumstances, for she was then the promised bride of Mr. Cheesacre. But how was he to get down again among his friends? That consideration troubled Mr. Cheesacre as he rose from his happy seat after that last embrace. He had promised Charlie, and perhaps he would keep his promise, but it might be as well not to make it all too public at once. But Charlie wasn't going to be thrown over, not if she knew it, as she said to herself. She returned, therefore, triumphantly among them all, blushing indeed, and with her eyes turned away, and her hand now remained upon her lover's arm, but still so close to him that there could be no mistake. "Goodness gracious, Charlie, where have you and Mr. Cheesacre been?" said Mrs. Greenow.
"We got up into the woods and lost ourselves," said Charlie.
"Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Greenow. It would be too long to tell now, in these last pages of our story, how Cheesacre strove to escape, and with what skill Mrs. Greenow kept him to his bargain. I hope that Charlie Fairstairs was duly grateful. Before that evening was over, under the comfortable influence of a glass of hot brandy and water, the widow had, I think, herself mixed the second glass for Mr. Cheesacre before the influence became sufficiently comfortable, he was forced to own that he had made himself the happy possessor of Charlie Fairstairs' heart and hand. "And you're a lucky man," said the widow with enthusiasm, "and I congratulate you with all my heart. Don't let there be any delay now, because a good thing can't be done too soon." And indeed, before that night was over, Mrs. Greenow had the pair together in her own presence, and then fixed the day. "The fellow ought to be allowed to turn himself," Cheesacre said to her, pleading for himself in a whisper. But no, Mrs. Greenow would give him no such mercy. She knew to what a man turning himself might probably lead. She was a woman who was quite in earnest when she went to work, and I hope that Miss Fairstairs was grateful. Then, in that presence, was in truth the last kiss given on that eventful evening. "Come, Charlie, be good-natured to him. He's as good as your own now," said the widow, and Charlie was good-natured.
"It's to be as soon as ever we come back from our trip," said Mrs. Greenow to Kate the next day, "and I'm lending her money to get all her things at once. He shall come to scratch, though I go all the way to Norfolk by myself and fetch him by his ears. He shall come, as sure as my name's Greenow, or Belfield, as it will be then, you know."
"And I shouldn't wonder if she did have to go to Norfolk," said Kate to her cousin. That event, however, cannot be absolutely concluded in these pages. I can only say that, when I think of Mrs. Greenow's force of character and warmth of friendship, I feel that Miss Fairstairs' prospects stand on good ground. Mrs. Greenow's own marriage was completed with perfect success. She took Captain Bellfield for better or for worse, with a thorough determination to make the best of his worst, and to put him on his legs, if any such putting might be possible. He, at any rate, had been in luck. If any possible stroke of fortune could do him good, he had found that stroke. He had found a wife who could forgive all his past offences, and also, if necessary, some future offences, who had money enough for all his wants, and kindness enough to gratify them, and who had, moreover, which for the captain was the most important, strength enough to keep from him the power of ruining them both. Reader, let us wish a happy married life to Captain and Mrs. Bellfield. The day after the ceremony, Alice Vavasor and Kate Vavasor started for Matching Priory. End of chapter 78.
Chapter 79 of Can You Forgive Her? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Can You Forgive Her? By Anthony Trollope. Chapter 79. Diamonds Are Diamonds. Kate and Alice, as they drew near to their journey's end, were both a little flurried, and I cannot but own that there was cause for nervousness. Kate Vavasor was to meet Mr. Grey for the first time. Mr. Grey was now staying at Matching, and was to remain there until a week of his marriage. He was then to return to Cambridgeshire for a day or two, and after that was to become a guest at the rector's house at Matching the evening before the ceremony. "Why not let him come here at once?" Lady Glencora had said to her husband. "It is such nonsense, you know." But Mr. Palliser would not hear of it. Mr. Palliser, though a radical in public life, would not for worlds transgress the social laws of his ancestors, and so the matter was settled. Kate, on this very day of her arrival at Matching, would thus see Mr. Grey for the first time, and she could not but feel that she had been the means of doing Mr. Grey much injury. She had, moreover, something, not much indeed, but still something, of that feeling which made the Pallisers terrible to the imagination because of their rank and wealth. She was a little afraid of the Pallisers, but of Mr. Grey she was very much afraid. And Alice also was not at her ease. She would fain have prevented so very quick a marriage, had she not felt that now, after all the trouble that she had caused, there was nothing left for her but to do as others wished. When a day had been named, she had hardly dared to demur, and had allowed Lady Glencora to settle everything as she had wished. But it was not only the suddenness of her marriage which dismayed her. Its nature and attributes were terrible to her. Both Lady Midlothian and the Marchioness of Auld Reekie were coming. When this was told to her by letter, she had no means of escape. "Lady Macleod is right in nearly all that she says," Lady Glencora had written to her. "At any rate, you needn't be such a fool as to run away from your cousins, simply because they have handles to their names. You must take the thing as it comes." Lady Glencora, moreover, had settled for her the list of bridesmaids. Alice had made a petition that she might be allowed to go through the ceremony with only one, with none but Kate to back her. But she ought to have known that when she consented to be married at Matching, and indeed she had had very little power of resisting that proposition, all such questions would be decided for her. 2 daughters, therefore, of Lady Midlothian were to act, Lady Jane and Lady Mary, and the one daughter of the Marchioness, who was also a Lady Jane, and there were to be 2 Miss Howards down from London, girls who were known both to Alice and to Lady Glencora, and who were in some distant way connected with them both. A great attempt was made to induce the 2 Miss Pallisers to join the bevy, but they had frankly pleaded their age. "No woman should stand up as a bridesmaid," said the strong-minded Sophie, "who doesn't mean to get married if she can. Now, I don't mean to get married, and I won't put myself among the young people." Lady Glencora was therefore obliged to submit to do the work with only 6, but she swore that they should be very smart. She was to give all the dresses, and Mr. Palliser was to give a brooch and an armlet to each. "She is the only person in the world I want to pet, except yourself," Lady Glencora had said to her husband, and he had answered by giving her carte blanche as regards expense. All this was very terrible to Kate, who had not much feminine taste for finery. Of the dress she had heard, of the dress which was waiting at Matching to be made up after her arrival, though as yet she knew nothing of the trinkets. There are many girls who could submit themselves at a moment to the kindness of such a woman as Lady Glencora. Perhaps most girls would do so, for of all such women in the world Lady Glencora was the least inclined to patronize or to be condescending in her kindness. But Kate Vavasor was one to whom such submission would not come easily. "I wish I was out of this boat," she said to Alice in the train. "So that I might be shipwrecked alone?" "No, there can be no shipwreck to you. When the day of action comes you will be taken away, up to heaven, upon the clouds. But what are they to do with me?" "You'll find that Glencora will not desert you. You can't conceive what taste she has." "I'd sooner be bridesmaid to Charlie Fairstairs. I would indeed. My place in the world is not among cabinet ministers and old countesses." "Nor mine." "Yes, it seems that yours is to be there. They are your cousins, and you have made, at any rate, one great friend among them, one who is to be the biggest of them all." "And are you going to throw me over, Kate?" "To tell the truth, Alice, I sometimes think you had better throw me over. I know it would be sad, sad for both, but perhaps it would be better. I have done you much harm and no good, and now where I am going I shall disgrace you." She talked even of getting out at some station and returning, and would have done so had not Alice made it impossible. As it was, the evening found her and Alice together entering the park gate at Matching in Lady Glencora's carriage. Lady Glencora had sent a note to the station. She could not come herself, she said, because Mr. Palliser was a little fussy. "You'll understand, dear, but don't say a word." Alice didn't say a word, having been very anxious not to lower Mr. Palliser in her cousin's respect. None of the Lady Janes and Lady Marys were at Matching when they arrived. Indeed, there was no guest there but Mr. Grey, for which Kate felt herself to be extremely grateful. Mr. Grey came into the hall, standing behind Mr. Palliser, who stood behind his wife. Alice passed by them both, and was at once in her lover's arms. "Then I must introduce myself," said Lady Glencora to Kate, "and my husband also." This she did, and no woman in England could have excelled her in the manner of doing it. "I have heard so much about you," said she, still keeping Kate's hand, "and I know how good you've been, and how wicked you have been," she added in a whisper. Then Mr. Grey was brought up to her, and they were introduced. It was not till some days had passed over them that she felt herself at all at her ease with Mr. Grey, and I doubt whether she ever reached that point with Mr. Palliser. But Lady Glencora she knew, and liked, and almost loved, from the first moment of their meeting. "Have you heard the news?" said Lady Glencora to Alice, the first minute that they were alone. Alice, of course, had not heard the news. "Mr. Bott is going to marry Mrs. Marsham. There is such a row about it. Plantagenet is nearly mad. I never knew him so disgusted in my life. Of course I don't dare to tell him so, but I am so heartily rejoiced. You know how I love them both, and I could not possibly wish any better reward for either." Alice, who had personally known more of Mr. Bott than of Mrs. Marsham, said that she couldn't but be sorry for the lady. "She's old enough to be his mother," said Lady Glencora. "Otherwise I really don't know any people better suited to each other. The best is, that Mr. Bott is doing it to regain his footing with Mr. Palliser. I am sure of that. And Plantagenet will never speak to him again. But, Alice, there is other news." "What other news?" "It is hardly news yet, and of course I am very wicked to tell you, but I feel sure Mr. Grey knows all about it, and if I didn't tell, he would." "He hasn't told me anything yet." "He hasn't had time, and when he does you mustn't pretend to know. I believe Mr. Palliser will certainly be Chancellor of the Exchequer before next month, and if so, he'll never come in for Silverbridge again." "But he'll be in Parliament, will he not?" "Oh yes, he'll be in Parliament. I don't understand all about it. There is a man going out for the county, for Barsetshire, some man whom the Duke used to favour, and he wants Plantagenet to come in for that. I can't understand what difference it makes." "But he will be in the Cabinet." "Oh yes, but who do you suppose is to be the new member for Silverbridge?" "I can't guess," said Alice, though of course she did guess. "Mind, I don't know it. He has never told me. But he told me that he had been with the Duke, and asked the Duke to let Jeffrey have the seat. The Duke became as black as thunder, and said that Jeffrey had no fortune. In short, he wouldn't hear of it. Poor Jeffrey! We must try to do something for him, but I really don't know how. Then the Duke said that Plantagenet should put in for Silverbridge some friend who would support himself, and I fancy, mind, it's only fancy, but I fancy that Plantagenet mentioned to his Grace one Mr. Grey." "Oh, Glencora!" "They've been talking together till sometimes I think Mr. Grey is worse than Plantagenet. When Mr. Grey began to say something the other night in the drawing room about sugar, I knew it was all up with you. He'll be a financial secretary, you see if he isn't, or a lord of something, or an under somebody of state. And then some day he'll go mad, either because he does, or because he doesn't, get into the Cabinet." Lady Glencora, as she said all this, knew well that the news she was giving would please her cousin better than any other tidings that could be told. By degrees the guests came. The two Miss Howards were the first, and they expressed themselves as delighted with Lady Glencora's taste and with Mr. Palliser's munificence. For at that time the brooches and armlets had been produced. Kate had said very little about these matters, but the Miss Howards were loud in their thanks. But they were good-humoured, merry girls, and the house was pleasanter after their arrival than it had been before. Then came the dreaded personage, the guest, Lady Midlothian. On the subject of Lady Midlothian Kate had really become curious. She had a real desire to see the face and gait of the woman, and to hear her voice. Lady Midlothian came, and with her came Lady Jane and Lady Mary. I am by no means sure that Lady Jane and Lady Mary were not nearly as old as the two Miss Pallisers, but they were not probably so fully resolved as to the condition of their future modes of living as were those two ladies, and if so, they were not wrong to shine as bridesmaids. With them Alice had made some slight acquaintance during the last spring in London, and as they were now to attend upon her as the bride, they were sufficiently gracious. To Kate, too, they were civil enough, and things in public went on very pleasantly at Matching. A scene there was, of course, between Alice and Lady Midlothian, a scene in private. "You must go through it," Lady Glencora had said, with jocose mournfulness. "And why should you not let her jump upon you a little? It can't hurt you now." "But I don't like people to jump upon me," Alice said. "And why are you to have everything just as you like it? You are so unreasonable. Think how I've been jumped on. Think what I have borne from them. If you knew the things she used to say to me, you would not be such a coward. I was sent down to her for a week, and had no power of helping myself. And the Marchioness used to be sent for to look at me, for she never talks. She used to look at me and groan, and hold up her hands, till I hated her the worst of the two. Think what they did to me, and yet they are my dear friends now. Why should you escape altogether?" Alice could not escape altogether, and therefore was closeted with Lady Midlothian for the best part of an hour. "Did Lady Macleod read to you what I wrote?" the Countess asked. "Yes, that is, she gave me the letter to read." "And I hope you understand me, Alice?" "Oh, yes, I suppose so." "You suppose so, my dear? If you only suppose so, I shall not be contented. I want you to appreciate my feelings towards you thoroughly. I want you to know that I am most anxious as to your future life, and that I am thoroughly satisfied with the step you are now taking." The Countess paused, but Alice said nothing. Her tongue was itching to tell the old woman that she cared nothing for this expression of satisfaction, but she was aware that she had done much that was deserving of punishment, and resolved to take this as part of her penance. She was being jumped upon, and it was unpleasant; but after all that had happened, it was only fitting that she should undergo much unpleasantness. "Thoroughly satisfied," continued the Countess; "and now I only wish to refer, in the slightest manner possible, to what took place between us when we were both of us under this roof last winter." "Why refer to it at all, Lady Midlothian?" "Because I think it may do good, and because I cannot make you understand that I have thoroughly forgiven everything, unless I tell you that I have forgiven that also. On that occasion I had come all the way from Scotland on purpose to say a few words to you. I am so sorry that you should have had the trouble." "I do not regret it, Alice. I never do regret doing anything which I believe to have been my duty. There is no knowing how far what I said then may have operated for good." Alice thought that she knew very well, but she said nothing. "I must confess that what I then understood to be your obstinacy, and I must say also, if I tell the truth, your indifference to all prudential considerations whatever, not to talk of appearances and decorum, and I might say anything like a high line of duty or moral conduct, shocked me very much. It did indeed, my dear. Taking it all together, I don't know that I was ever more shocked in my life. The thing was so inscrutable." Here Lady Midlothian held up one hand in a manner that was truly imposing. "So inscrutable! But that is all over now. What was personally offensive to myself I could easily forgive, and I do forgive it. I shall never think of it any more." Here Lady Midlothian put up both her hands gently, as though wafting the injury away into the air. "But what I wish specially to say to you is this. Your own conduct is forgiven also." Here she paused again, and Alice winced. Who was this dreadful old countess? What was the countess to her, that she should be thus tormented with the old woman's forgiveness? John Grey had forgiven her, and of external forgiveness that was enough. She had not forgiven herself, would never forgive herself altogether, and the pardon of no old woman in England could assist her in doing so. She had sinned, but she had not sinned against Lady Midlothian. "Let her jump upon you, and have done with it," Lady Glencora had said. She had resolved that it should be so, but it was very hard to keep her resolution. "The Marchioness and I have talked it over," continued Lady Midlothian, "and she has asked me to speak for both her and myself." There is comfort, at any rate, in that, thought Alice, who had never yet seen the Marchioness. "We have resolved that all those little mistakes should be as though they had never been committed. We shall both be most happy to receive you and your husband, who is, I must say, one of the most gentlemanlike looking men I ever saw. It seems that he and Mr. Palliser are on most friendly, I may say, most confidential terms, and that must be quite a pleasure to you." "It's a pleasure to him, which is more to the purpose," said Alice. "Exactly so. And now, my dear, everything is forgiven and shall be forgotten. Come and give me a kiss, and let me wish you joy." Alice did as she was bidden, and accepted the kiss and the congratulations, and a little box of jewellery which Lady Midlothian produced from out of her pocket. "The diamonds are from the Marchioness, my dear, whose means, as you doubtless are aware, greatly exceed my own. The garnets are from me. I hope they may both be worn long and happily." I hardly know which was the worst, the lecture, the kiss, or the present. The latter she would have declined had it been possible, but it was not possible. When she had agreed to be married at Matching, she had not calculated the amount of punishment which would thereby be inflicted on her. But I think that, though she bore it impatiently, she was aware that she had deserved it. Although she fretted herself greatly under the infliction of Lady Midlothian, she acknowledged to herself, even at the time, that she deserved all the lashes she received. She had made a fool of herself in her vain attempt to be greater and grander than other girls, and it was only fair that her folly should be in some sort punished before it was fully pardoned. John Grey punished it after one fashion, by declining to allude to it, or to think of it, or to take any account of it. And now Lady Midlothian had punished it after another fashion, and Alice went out of the Countess's presence with sundry inward exclamations of "mea culpa," and with many unseen beatings of the breast. 2 days before the ceremony came the Marchioness and her august daughter. Her Lady Jane was much more august than the other Lady Jane, very much more august indeed. She had very long flaxen hair, and very light blue eyes, which she did not move frequently, and she spoke very little, one may almost say not at all, and she never seemed to do anything. But she was very august, and was, as all the world knew, engaged to marry the Duke of Dumfriesshire, who, though twice her own age, was as yet childless, as soon as he should have completed his mourning for his first wife. Kate told her cousin that she did not at all know how she should ever stand up as one in a group with so august a person as this Lady Jane, and Alice herself felt that such an attendant would quite obliterate her. But Lady Jane and her mother were both harmless. The Marchioness never spoke to Kate, and hardly spoke to Alice, and the Marchioness's Lady Jane was quite as silent as her mother. On the morning of this day, the day on which these very august people came, a telegram arrived at the Priory calling for Mr. Palliser's immediate presence in London. He came to Alice full of regret, and behaved himself very nicely. Alice now regarded him quite as a friend. "Of course I understand," she said, "and I know that the business which takes you up to London pleases you." "Well, yes, it does please me. I am glad. I don't mind saying so to you. But it does not please me to think that I shall be away at your marriage. Pray make your father understand that it was absolutely unavoidable. But I shall see him, of course, when I come back, and I shall see you too before very long." "Shall you?" "Oh yes." "And why so?" "Because Mr. Grey must be at Silverbridge for his election. But perhaps I ought not tell you his secrets." Then he took her into the breakfast parlour and showed her his present. It was a service of Sèvres china, very precious and beautiful. "I got you these things because Grey likes china." "So do I like china," said she, with her face brighter than he had ever yet seen it. "I thought you would like them best," said he. Alice, looking up at him with her eyes full of tears, told him that she did like them best, and then, as he wished her all happiness, and as he was stooping over her to kiss her, Lady Glencora came in. "I beg pardon," said she. "I was just 1 minute too soon, was I not?" "She would have them sent here and unpacked," said Mr. Palliser, "though I told her it was foolish." "Of course I would," said Lady Glencora. "Everything shall be unpacked and shown. It's easy to get somebody to pack them again." Much of the wedding tribute had already been deposited with the china, and among other things there were the jewels that Lady Midlothian had brought. "Upon my word, her ladyship's diamonds are not to be sneezed at," said Lady Glencora. "I don't care for diamonds," said Alice. Then Lady Glencora took up the Countess's trinkets, and shook her head and turned up her nose. There was a wonderfully comic expression on her face as she did so. "To me they are just as good as the others," said Alice. "To me they are not, then," said Lady Glencora. "Diamonds are diamonds, and garnets are garnets, and I am not so romantic but what I know the difference." On the evening before the marriage, Alice and Lady Glencora walked for the last time through the Priory ruins. It was now September, and the evenings were still long, so that the ladies could get out upon the lawn after dinner. Whether Lady Glencora would have been allowed to walk through the ruins so late as 8:30 in the evening if her husband had been there may be doubtful, but her husband was away, and she took this advantage of his absence. "Do you remember that night we were here?" said Lady Glencora. "When shall I forget it? Or how is it possible that such a night should ever be forgotten?" "No, I shall never forget it. Oh dear, what wonderful things have happened since that! Do you ever think of Jeffrey?" "Yes, of course I think of him. I did like him so much. I hope I shall see him some day." "And he liked you too, young woman. And what was more, young woman, I thought at one time that, perhaps, you were going to like him in earnest." "Not in that way, certainly." "You've done much better, of course, especially as poor Jeffrey's chance of promotion doesn't look so good now. If I have a boy, I wonder whether he'll hate me." "Why should he hate you?" "I can't help it, you know, if he does. Only think what it is to Plantagenet. Have you seen the difference it makes in him already?" "Of course it makes a difference, the greatest difference in the world. And think what it will be to me, Alice. I used to lie in bed and wish myself dead, and make up my mind to drown myself, if I could only dare. I shan't think any more of that poor fellow now." Then she told Alice what had been done for Burgo, how his uncle had paid his bills once again, and had agreed to give him a small income. "Poor fellow," said Lady Glencora, "it won't do more than buy him gloves, you know." The marriage was magnificent, greatly to the dismay of Alice, and to the discomfort of Mr. Vavasor, who came down on the eve of the ceremony, arriving while his daughter and Lady Glencora were in the ruins. Mr. Grey seemed to take it all very easily, and, as Lady Glencora said, played his part exactly as though he were in the habit of being married, at any rate, once a year. "Nothing on earth will ever put him out, so you need not try, my dear," she said, as Alice stood with her a moment alone in the dressing room upstairs before her departure. "I know that," said Alice, "and therefore I shall never try." End of chapter 79. Recording by Laura Koskinen. Chapter 80 of Can You Forgive Her? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Can You Forgive Her? By Anthony Trollope. Chapter 80. The story is finished within the halls of the Duke of Omnium. Mr. Grey and wife were duly carried away from Matching Priory by post horses, and did their honeymoon, we may be quite sure, with much satisfaction. When Alice was first asked where she would go, she simply suggested that it should not be to Switzerland. They did, in truth, go by slow stages to Italy, to Venice, Florence, and on to Rome, but such had not been their intention when they first started on their journey. At that time Mr. Grey believed that he would be wanted again in England, down at Silverbridge in Barsetshire, very shortly. But before he had married a week, he learned that all that was to be postponed. The cup of fruition had not yet reached Mr. Palliser's lips. "There will be no vacancy either in the county or in the borough till Parliament meets." That had been the message sent by Mr. Palliser to Mr. Grey. Lady Glencora's message to Alice had been rather more full, having occupied 3 pages of note paper, the last of which had been crossed, but I do not know that it was more explicit. She had abused Lord Brock, had abused Mr. Finespun, and had abused all public things and institutions, because the arrangements as now proposed would be very comfortable to Alice, but would not, as she was pleased to think, be very comfortable to herself. "You can go to Rome and see everything and enjoy yourself, which I was not allowed to do, and all this noise and bother and crowd of electioneering will take place down in Barsetshire, just when I am in the middle of all my trouble." There were many very long letters came from Lady Glencora to Rome during the winter, letters which Alice enjoyed thoroughly, but which she could not but regard as being very indiscreet. The Duke was at the castle during the Christmas week, and the descriptions of the Duke and of his solicitude as to his heir were very comic. "He comes and bends over me on the sofa in the most stupendous way, as though a woman to be the mother of his heir must be a miracle in nature. He is quite awful when he says a word or two, and more awful in his silence. The devil prompted me the other day, and I said I hoped it would be a girl. There was a look came over his face which nearly frightened me. If it should be, I believe he will turn me out of the house, but how can I help it? I wish you were going to have a baby at the same time. Then if yours was a boy and mine a girl, we'd make a change." This was very indiscreet. Lady Glencora would write indiscreet letters like this, which Alice could not show to her husband. It was 1,000 pities. But December and January wore themselves away, and the time came in which the Greys were bound to return to England. The husband had very fully discussed with his wife that matter of his parliamentary ambition, and found in her a very ready listener. Having made up his mind to do this thing, he was resolved to do it thoroughly, and was becoming almost as full of politics, almost as much devoted to sugar, as Mr. Palliser himself. He, at any rate, could not complain that his wife would not interest herself in his pursuits. Then, as they returned, came letters from Lady Glencora, written as her troubles grew nigh. The Duke had gone, of course, but he was to be there at the appointed time. "Oh, I do so wish he would have a fit of the gout in London, or at Timbuctoo," said Lady Glencora. When they reached London, they first heard the news from Mr. Vavasor, who on this occasion condescended to meet them at the railway. "The Duke has got an heir," he said, before the carriage door was open, "born this morning." One might have supposed that it was the Duke's baby, and not the baby of Lady Glencora and Mr. Palliser. There was a note from Mr. Palliser to Mr. Grey. "Thank God," said the note, "Lady Glencora and the boy." Mr. Palliser had scorned to use the word child. "Lady Glencora and the boy are quite as well as can be expected. Both the new writs were moved for last night." Mr. Palliser's honours, as will be seen, came rushing upon him all at once. Wondrous little baby! Purpureo genitus! What have the gods not done for thee, if thou canst only manage to live till thy good things are all thine own, to live through all the terrible solicitude with which they will envelop thee. Better than royal rank will be thine, with influence more than royal, and power of action fettered by no royalty. Royal wealth which will be really thine own, to do with it as it beseemeth thee. Thou wilt be at the top of an aristocracy in a country where aristocrats need gird themselves with no buckram. All that the world can give will be thine. And yet when we talk of thee religiously, philosophically, or politico-economically, we are wont to declare that thy chances of happiness are no better, if they be no worse, than are those of thine infant neighbour just born in that farmyard cradle. Who shall say that they are better or that they are worse? Or if they be better or if they be worse, how shall we reconcile to ourselves that seeming injustice? And now we will pay a little visit to the small one, born in the purple, and the story of that visit shall be the end of our history. It was early in April, quite early in April, and Mr. and Mrs. Grey were both at Gatherum Castle. Mrs. Grey was there at the moment of which we write, but Mr. Grey was absent at Silverbridge with Mr. Palliser. This was the day of the Silverbridge election, and Mr. Grey had gone to that ancient borough to offer himself as a candidate to the electors, backed by the presence and aid of a very powerful member of the Cabinet. Lady Glencora and Alice were sitting upstairs, with the small purple-born one in their presence, and the small purple-born one was lying in Alice's lap. "It is such a comfort that it is over," said the mother. "You are the most ungrateful of women. Oh, Alice, if you could have known! Your baby may come just as it pleases. You won't lie awake trembling how on earth you will bear your disgrace, if one of the vile, weaker sex should come to disturb the hopes of your lords and masters. For I had two, which made it so much more terrible. I'm sure Mr. Palliser would not have said a word. No, he would have said nothing, nor would the Duke. The Duke would simply have gone away instantly, and never have seen me again till the next chance comes, if it ever does come. And Mr. Palliser would have been as gentle as a dove, much more gentle than he is now, for men are rarely gentle in their triumph. But I should have known what they both thought and felt. It's all right now, dear. Yes, my bonny boy, you have made it all right for me, have you not? And Lady Glencora took her baby into her own arms. You have made everything right, my little man. But oh, Alice, if you had seen the Duke's long face through those 3 days, if you had heard the tones of the people's voices as they whispered about me, if you had encountered the oppressive cheerfulness of those 2 London doctors. Doctors are such bad actors. You would have thought it impossible for any woman to live throughout. There's one comfort. If my little mannikin lives, I can't have another eldest. He looks like living, don't he, Alice? Then were perpetrated various mysterious ceremonies of feminine idolatry, which were continued till there came a grandly dressed old lady, who called herself the nurse, and who took the idol away. In the course of that afternoon, Lady Glencora took Alice all over the house. It was a castle of enormous size, quite new, having been built by the present proprietor, very cold, very handsome, and very dull. "What an immense place!" said Alice, as she stood looking round her in the grand hall, which was never used as an entrance except on very grand occasions. "Is it not? And it cost, oh, I can't tell you how much it cost. 100,000 or more. Well, that would be nothing, as the Duke, no doubt, had the money in his pocket to do what he liked with at the time. But the joke is, nobody ever thinks of living here. Who'd live in such a great overgrown place such as this, if they could get a comfortable house like Matching? Do you remember Long Royston and the hot water pipes? I always think of the poor Duchess when I come through here. Nobody ever lives here, or ever will. The Duke comes for 1 week in the year, and Plantagenet says he hates to do that. As for me, nothing on earth shall ever make me live here. I was completely in their power, and couldn't help their bringing me here the other day, because I had, as it were, disgraced myself." "How disgraced yourself?" "In being so long, you know, before that gentleman was born. But they shan't play me the same trick again. I shall dare to assert myself now. Come, we must go away. There are some of the British public come to see one of the British sights. That's another pleasure here. One has to run about to avoid being caught by the visitors. The housekeeper tells me they always grumble because they are not allowed to go into my little room upstairs." On the evening of that day, Mr. Palliser and Mr. Grey returned home from Silverbridge together. The latter was then a member of Parliament, but the former at that moment was the possessor of no such dignity. The election for the borough was now over, whereas that for the county had not yet taken place. But there was no rival candidate for the position, and Mr. Palliser was thoroughly contented with his fate. He was at this moment actually Chancellor of the Exchequer, and in about 10 days' time would be on his legs in the House, proposing for his country's use his scheme of finance. The 2 men were seated together in an open carriage, and were being whirled along by 4 horses. They were both, no doubt, happy in their ambition, but I think that of the 2, Mr. Palliser showed his triumph the most. Not that he spoke even to his friend a word that was triumphant in its tone. It was not thus that he rejoiced. He was by nature too placid for that. But there was a nervousness in his contentment which told the tale to any observer who might know how to read it. "I hope you'll like it," he said to Grey. "I shall never like it as you do," Grey answered. "And why not? Why not?" "In the first place, I have not begun it so young." "Any time before 35 is young enough." "For useful work, yes, but hardly for enjoyment in the thing. And then I don't believe it all as you do. To you the British House of Commons is everything." "Yes, everything," said Mr. Palliser, with unwonted enthusiasm. "Everything, everything. That and the Constitution are everything." "It is not so to me." "Ah, but it will be. If you really take to the work and put yourself into harness, it will be so. You'll get to feel it as I do. The man who is counted by his colleagues as number 1 on the Treasury bench in the English House of Commons is the first of living men. That's my opinion. I don't know that I ever said it before, but that's my opinion." "And who is the second, the purse bearer to this great man?" "I say nothing about the second. I don't know that there is any second. I wonder how we shall find Lady Glencora and the boy." They had then arrived at the side entrance to the castle, and Mr. Grey ran upstairs to his wife's room to receive her congratulations. "And you are a member of Parliament?" she asked. "They tell me so, but I don't know whether I actually am one till I've taken the oaths." "I am so happy. There's no position in the world so glorious." "It's a pity you are not Mr. Palliser's wife. That's just what he has been saying." "Oh, John, I am so happy. It is so much more than I have deserved. I hope, that is, I sometimes think—" "Think what, dearest?" "I hope nothing that I have ever said has driven you to it." "I'd do more than that, dear, to make you happy," he said, as he put his arm round her and kissed her. "More than that, at least, if it were in my power." Probably my readers may agree with Alice, that in the final adjustment of her affairs she had received more than she had deserved. All her friends, except her husband, thought so. But as they have all forgiven her, including even Lady Midlothian herself, I hope that they who have followed her story to its close will not be less generous. End of chapter 80. End of Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Laura Koskinen.